Holy and loving God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. It's truly amazing how deeply the story of Jesus has penetrated into my consciousness, and I believe into our group conscious. It feels so pervasive and so true that I was caught off guard by just how little it surprises me. I'll explain. The first few lines of the gospel that we hear from Mark today tells of Jesus explaining the betrayal, death, and resurrection of the Son of Man. Hopefully, when you hear Son of Man, you immediately think he's talking about himself, and you get the gold star. He is talking about himself. But the disciples, they were confused. You see, we know how the story unfolds. They are just trying to put the puzzle together without a picture yet. So, in the slightly convoluted language we hear this morning, Jesus refers to himself in the third person as the Son of Man. And that particular language is familiar to them too, but in a completely different context. The disciples might easily be thinking about the book of Daniel. You know, the one with the lions in the Old Testament. The book of Daniel contains this same phrase, but with an entirely different implication, at least to them, which they would have known. The book of Daniel recounts a vision where the Son of Man rides in on the clouds. Daniel 7:14 says, the Son of Man is given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshiped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. So this imagery from Daniel can be heard in a couple of ways. Knowing the story, yeah, that's Jesus, right? I can hear that. I can hear that echo of what is to come in Jesus in that. But for the disciples, that's a little like expecting the president to lay down and not do anything. It doesn't make sense. They have a different narrative. It's profoundly different from the narrative that Jesus recounts on the road to Capernaum. To them, this image from Daniel would likely be one of power, of might and majesty, conquering hero who arrives on the clouds to save his people. This morning, we are reminded that the true path for Jesus is powerful in a very different way. Christ's strength is not that of a conquering warrior who destroys his enemy with lightning bolts and lays waste to the powers that be. He doesn't even argue convincingly to save himself. No, this morning reminds us of who he is and where he is headed. And the disciples are rightly confused. The Son of Man can be betrayed by humans? That just doesn't make any sense. The kingdom, he would die? He's the king. It doesn't work in their context. It doesn't make sense to them. But it does to us because we have a leg up on the disciples. We know the story. This is what I meant earlier. What we can see that is happening. And this reality of Jesus has so penetrated our lives, my life at least, and my psyche, that I never question the meaning, or I don't always question the meaning. I know how it ends. I can't see it afresh every time. It seems to me that I am somehow, and maybe we are all somehow, oddly comfortable with the story of Jesus and his radical servant leadership. Now, as some of you know, I participated in clinical pastoral education this summer, and we call it CPE. It's a program or a class of chaplaincy work that almost every seminarian participates in during their time of formal education. Most often, folks are in hospital settings, helping families and loved ones work through trauma or illness or whatever comes to the hospital. And they also consider the hospital staff and doctors and nurses and orderlies part of their charge, affording them care as the staff is able due to time constraints. I was not in a hospital this summer. Rather, I spent my time in CPE at Goodwin House, both in Alexandria and at Bailey's Crossroads. And for those who don't know, which is probably a pretty small number, Goodwin House is a wonderful community for aging adults that was founded by the Episcopal Church. It has a full spectrum of life and a full spectrum of care. It was at Bailey's Crossroads where I had a chance to meet a care team member named Nancy. Well, I'll call her Nancy, that's not her name. She was approaching 10 years of employment at Bailey's Crossroads. Like nearly all the staff at Goodwin House, Nancy was joyful, but mostly busy. In this particular moment between tasks, she was able to take some time to tell me a little bit of her story. I asked Nancy how it had been for the past year working through the pandemic in this place. She'd been deeply concerned about the residents' health and their well-being, but she's also a mother of two and was worried about her family. Her husband is also in the healthcare field at another location locally, constantly at risk being exposed to different groups, and what were they bringing home to share with their family and then take back to their respective work sites. In short, she said, it's felt like forever. It was really everyone so isolated. Our residents ate by themselves every meal. It just made me so sad. She would go on to say that as with so many other folks in healthcare, and particularly during the pandemic, she and her spouse worked opposing shifts to make sure there was always a parent at home. She would work days and he would work evenings. And so she would be gone as he got there. And when he got back, she was in bed asleep or asleep. And she was gone before he got up in the morning. When they were together, they had masks on all the time. Now, this is tough enough on its own, but I was completely blown away by what she said next. Nancy and her husband agreed that the health of their patients was essential, and they were committed to their patients' health just as much as they were committed to their family and to each other. So every night, Nancy would inflate a mattress in the closet in her bedroom to sleep on. She passed her pandemic nights isolated from her beloved so that she would further limit the exposure of those in her care. And why did she inflate the mattress every night, I asked. Well, we didn't want our children to think we didn't love each other. Her ritual was to create a bed in the closet and to leave the main bed for her husband when he got home, and to pack that bed away each morning to go greet her children. Nancy is part of a care team, meaning she tends to residents' needs. She's not a nurse, at least not in the capacity in which she works at Goodwin House. She might be, but I don't think so. She's not taken the Hippocratic Oath. She's not asked to do this to keep her job, because this is what service to her people meant to her. She and her husband were compelled to do this. They gave up each other for the sake of those in their care. And I should note, she wasn't sad about the story. It was not her lament that this was her situation. This was her obligation. This brought her joy. This brought her pride. This is who she was in the fiber of her being. I swear to God, it's folks like Nancy that'll get us through this. So maybe I'm not that used to the story of Jesus after all. Maybe I can still recognize the power of the story when I am able to hear it anew, as I did from Nancy, and hopefully you do as well. We can still recognize the power of this narrative, especially when we see it alive in our world. Nancy's story is similar to the radical message of love that we heard this morning. Whoever wants to be first of all, whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all. Last week, Robin recounted the heroic acts of Father Michael on September 11th. She offered to follow Jesus, but she wasn't sure that she could have done what this man had done. A sentiment I share. And now this morning, I offer another small piece of what it must have felt like for Jesus, and another burden which I do not want to share. But this is part of our call as Christians, to be servants. And maybe we can't get there all at once. But as I said before, maybe we can look for the 2% that we can change to take a step in that direction. What's the 2% today that I can do in service to my neighbor? Ask yourself how I can move closer today to the life of Christ. Thank God for Nancy and for all the folks like her who teach us, who inspire us, and who guide us, showing us the gospel is alive in their very being, and who show us by their lives and their deeds that this radical notion of servant leadership is indeed alive and well. Amen.